Okay, cool. Um, hello, dear Dakini's Whisper Sangha. Hello, Kandrola. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for letting me do this. Kandrola and I have been talking about this since we recorded our podcast, and I just wanted to trial something out with those of you who are here, see what your ideas are. I'm not intending to talk for too long, just to bring up a few different points of view and things like that from which we can kind of have a new perspective maybe on Dakinis. And so the title that we are thinking for this future workshop so far has been Dakini Feminine, a cross-cultural art workshop. I'm grateful for your interest and enthusiasm exploring this topic with me. Um, so to begin, what do I mean by like the Dakini feminine? I have chosen these particular words because I feel like they demonstrate both something that's very unique to our tradition in terms of the Dakini, but also very universal in terms of exploring this kind of transgressive feminine aspect of enlightenment and spirituality. And I would say that the feminine principle is something that exists in every tradition and era of humans' religious activity. The earliest discovered author, actually, in history, who's called Enkhudnana, the daughter of the Mesopotamian king Sargon of Akkad, lived approximately 4,200 years ago. And she had a series of texts carved into stone by hand in cuneiform, which is the earliest decipherable form of writing that we currently have from the Mediterranean region. And these were a series of hymns to a goddess called Inanna. Um, we are seeing her right now in my shared screen. And this was a very interesting goddess. I have like an extract from one of the poems here. Oh, interesting. Oh, yes, here. Um, in which she says about her goddess Inanna, in the forefront of the battlefield, all is struck down by you, O winged lady, like a bird. You scavenge the land like a changing storm. You change like a roaring storm. You roar, so forth. Here we see like a very we're painted a portrait of this goddess that defies conventional roles of women in that time in Mediterranean antiquity. She is a warrior. She is this passionate, chaotic being, an elemental being. And I think that's very interesting because in another text, not authored by Enkhudnana, we also see the courtship of Inanna and her companion Dumazid. Now, Dumazid is actually the fertility god out of them too. Inanna is more kind of this passionate goddess of war and sexuality. Um, and kind of corresponds in this way to some, like, I guess, Shaktic beliefs that we might have, whereas Dumazid is this, I guess, fertility god, and her passion for Dumazid is what activates him to come up from the underworld and to kind of initiate the necessary activity of fertility and crops and harvest upon the land. Um, and here I have, yeah, part of that poem in which she describes him in this like very sexual way, but also as this companion who is a plant and a fire and the honey, kind of a creative aspect. So I bring this ancient goddess as an example of how such an entity from the earliest times cut through some of our dualistic assumptions, where Inanna is both a deity of death, who administers kind of, the righteous punishment, I guess, on enemies, or the guides some mortals into like an underworld, but also motivates birth. So this is a goddess who must travel to the underworld to fulfill her duty, but also lives up in heaven. And when we study the classical period of Asian religion, we can see many deities like this gain popularity. For example, 2000 years after the writing of Inanna's hymns in the first century BC in Central Asia, we have the Kushan Empire come in, and that is coming from the area of modern day Afghanistan, then Bactria, and it spread all across Central Asia from Iran to India under King Kanishka. And King Kanishka was a very interesting figure because he embraced both these traditional Central Asian deities. And in his version, there was this goddess Nana, who you can see on the back of his coin here, in an anthropomorphic kind of female guise. And she was seen both as the grantor of kingship, but also the fighter of demons and an astral governor. But also, he was very interested in not banning the religious activities of empires that were already under his rule. And I think this was pointed out by a Shingon Buddhist abbot and historian Teiko Yamasaki as a very fundamental moment in Buddhist history, because actually this is right after Ahsoka's initial effort to kind of popularize Theravada Buddhism in the second century BC, and then now the whole Central Asian Mediterranean region is connected to India by another system and another kind of empirical movement. And this is right around the time that Mahayana beliefs took hold. And so, what Yamasaki says about this is Mahayana from the beginning included important ritual and devotional aspects that contributed to the formation of esoteric Buddhism. From the second century BCE to the second century CE, there was a general revival of Brahmanism that also affected Buddhism. Tribal faiths and folk beliefs were assimilated into Brahmanism, resulting in the rise of popular religion, Hinduism, that stimulated the further development of ritual elements already present in Mahayana and earlier Buddhism. So basically, he's highlighting that this cultural exchange that happened around this time between folk religions and shamanic kind of animistic religions of Central Asia and non-Vedic India were being canonized within Hinduism at the same time that a lot of ritual and deity worship was becoming more popular within Buddhism, and kind of a new form of Mahayana was coming into popular belief. And what I really appreciate about his analysis of this moment is that he is not saying that in Mahayana and Vajrayana and later Vajrayana, the devotional aspects are purely an outside influence, because actually this used to be a very popular theory here in the West, that basically any form of mysticism or magic or esoteric elements in Buddhism were a later corruption. He is saying actually they have always been present in Buddhism, potentially going back, including the teachings of Buddha Sakyamuni, and just became more canonized, I guess, during this time, and more streamlined and more popular. Because over the last century here in the West, that was actually refuted a lot by historians and archaeologists who were funded by British colonial powers. Examples of these people were James Ferguson, Henry Cole, who said that the Buddhist religion was absent of these spirit beings, and that it was later diluted by Hinduism and then incorporated more of a devotional element to it. And this was not coming out of nowhere. They were really motivated by the British imperialism of needing to like justify it and say that Britain is basically saving a fallen civilization in invading India. And so their theories very much coincided with some of the ideas of racial purity around that time, which were deeply problematic, in which they thought that, the Aryan Vedic invaders were the most pure. And so, in order to make that make sense, they ascribed the Buddha to an Aryan lineage. And then they said that the beliefs were therefore also pure and declined over time through mixing with folk tradition and the tribes. And I find that quite easy to refute that point of view because we can see that in the analysis of both early sutras and also Buddhist art, that spirit beings such as Asuras, Nagas, Yakshas, Rakshas are always appearing. We see it in the Buddhist teaching, we see it in the Jataka tales, the tales of his previous incarnations, we see it in his life story. There's an interesting text by Robert DiCaroli. It's this one called Haunting the Buddha. And I can create a little link to all of these afterwards and post them in the Discord. Um, that draws on a lot of examples of this, such as, for example, in the Anuggata Nikaya, there's a large group of Nepali royals who ask the Buddha how they can maintain their reign, and the Buddha replied that they should venerate and make offerings to the old yaksha residences in their regions. And we see these venerations depicted in some of the earliest Buddhist art. For example, here, this is from Chandravaram, which is one of the oldest Buddhist sites. And here we see a group of worshippers bringing food. So all the worshippers are on the left of the image, bringing food and other offerings to a spirit who's emerging out of a tree. And this is very similar to other parts of the stupa where we see worshippers bringing similar offerings to the Bodhi tree. And so this is kind of part of Buddhist practice. And this tree is not any tree, it is surrounded by a fence. So we know that this is a residence of a local deity or a local yaksha. So it's interesting because sometimes this incorporation of beliefs that were called local or folk beliefs into Buddhism have been cast as, oh, well, that was just the Buddhist clergy kind of trying to connect with the largest amount of people possible, because unlike kind of the Brahmic elite, anyone could be a Buddhist, anyone could practice. And so they were pitted against each other, and it was seen that they would incorporate tribal, popular motifs in order to gain favor. But I find that that point kind of is quite limiting, I guess, to the Buddhist vision, because in the three turnings of the wheel, we really see the Buddha express that enlightenment is, something, a goal that's accessible to every single being. And therefore, any ritual or belief that is conducive to a life in which one can observe the precepts can be incorporated into the Buddhist path. But also, this incorporation to just become more popular and more acceptable as a religion washes away a lot of the transgressive elements that have been present in Buddhism from very early on. Some of these, beliefs about yakshas and rakshas were quite dangerous at the time of the Buddha, and we have this in the Dikaroli text as well, where he's saying, not all spirit deities dwelt in locations that were pleasant and comforting. Many seem to have chosen homes that were foreboding and situating in dangerous locations such as the deep wilderness or cremation grounds. In one tale, an ascetic and a gambler worshipping the Yakshiva dwells in a tree in the corner of a cemetery. they make the offerings of food to this Yakshiva for 3 nights before the wish is granted. And each night they have to brave the terror of the cremation ground in order to do so. So here we see this interest in the cremation ground that was already existing in some regions that really became more important and more venerated through Buddhism, because by the time of Nagarjuna, for example, in 200 CE, we see the monks really encouraged to embrace fear and embrace disgust into the path. In his discourses on the Great Wisdom, the practice of going to the charna ground and observing the 9 stages of decay of a corpse was canonized. After that, in the 4th and 6th centuries, actually, this kind of relationship to the charnel ground as something that is very conducive to a spiritual attitude became popular amongst more people than just Buddhists, even, because at this time, a contributing factor that some scholars cite is the Gupta and Vakataka dynasties, who were in the north and south of India and were very stabilizing for India, were starting to collapse. One of them due to a lot of Central Asian invasions, and then another one, it's the exact factors are not known, but this collapse created an atmosphere of uncertainty in some people's eyes that generated fear and, plague and, kind of general social disorder as something that became so widespread that basically the world in this time of conflict became a charnel ground. And this became something that a lot of people saw as important to the path. And this is where we see in, for example, the Shiva cults in Shaivat culture, the veneration of more fierce forms of gods like Bhairava. Bhairava was a god who might have predated the Vedas, might have been a non-Aryan entity who was seen as a wrathful god who you had to make offerings kind of against so that you don't feel his wrath. But then kind of became part of this grander Shiva system and was said to be one of Shiva's avatars in the Puranas. Um, and so this Kapalika cult grew around Bhairava, and Kapalika means skull bearers. And like you see on this image of Bhairava, like he is holding a skull cap the way that some of our tantric deities also do. And I think that's interesting because with Bhairava, there's like an actual, mythological element that explains why he has to carry the skull cup. It's because Shiva manifests this fierce avatar in order for him to cut off using his long nails one of the heads of Brahma, the creator god. And so it's the destroyer god claiming supremacy above the creator god. But because there's still a law, you can't just cut off a god's head, basically. Bhairava, this avatar, has to bear penance, and that skull cap is stuck to his hand, and he must carry it as his begging bowl in order for him to basically, really come to terms with the crime that he committed. But these Kapalikas, these followers of Bhairavas, who went to the charnel ground and also collected skulls, in some sources it said that it's specifically the skulls of Brahmins to really kind of upset the social order. That's not fully kind of clear, but anyway, we know that they carried these skulls in order to also transgress their preconceptions of purity and impurity, and eating from something that seems to have come from one of the things that we would have the biggest revulsion to as the path. But what's often not seen in this telling of the story is actually that Bhairava only gets to the charnel ground where he is released from this penance, where the begging skull finally leaves his hand, because he is led by a goddess called Brahmacharya, whose name means Brahmacide. And in the view of one scholar called Elizabeth Charlier Vishngram, this is both this goddess is like this transcending the dualistic nature goddess who is both his supreme punishment and the sole means of his atonement of benefaction. Um, and we see in her descriptions kind of again this transcendent feminine that we come to know from like ancient times in Inanna, but also in the Dakini, this kind of image that keeps coming up for a lot of cultures of this transgressive goddess who's described like this. Behold, within the body itself, that Chidi, resplendent like the fire at the end of time, wherein everything is dissolved and all the elements are consumed. This cremation ground is the form of the void, is the most terrible playground, the resort of the yoginis and the perfect ones. While all forms are disintegrated, the chains of obscurity are dispelled by this cycle of its own fiery rays, the sense organs, to reveal only the supreme state of bliss, free of all doubts. Having entered this receptacle of all the gods, this cremation ground of consciousness, so terrible with its innumerable funerary pyres strewn all around, who indeed will not attain perfection? So the question of how Shaivite Tantra and Buddhism influenced each other is like way too big to consider right now. But we know that by the time Nalanda University is established, also in 500 CE, and by the time it falls in 13th century CE, we have a lot of Buddhist masters and the Mahasiddhas lead their lives in a similar way to these Kapalika ascetics, but also passing around new written tantras in which we find the origin of a lot of our gods, the Chakra Samvara Tantra, from which we see Vajrayogini emerge. It's proliferated by Buddhist masters and scholars. And some of these deities are found in both pantheons or multiple pantheons. Even Vajrayogini can find her twin in the Shaktist movement of the Mahavidyas, these multiple forms of the goddess, as Chinnamasta, who is believed by many to actually be the Buddhist Vajrayogini adapted into one of the Shaktist cults because she was so popular and because she was such a powerful symbol. The difference is in their depiction, her head comes off because of this fire of Kundalini, or in our tradition, this could be equated to the rising of Tumo fire, kind of blasting the top chakra, clean off the body. Um, and in goddess like this, we also see not just using, the begging bowl of another slain being, but actually using your own body in order to feed, in order to, transgress even the obstacle of your preciousness or your perversion, I guess, of your own body in order to see things as they truly are by feeding it away. And, here we can open a lot of discussion with Chad, but I think this is like a brief tour through the influences on our current version of Dakini. I mean, these examples are by no means the only fierce feminine deities in the world, and there are infinite kind of lessons we could learn as Dakas and Dakinis from them. So I hope this brief overview can be developed later into like a multi-session workshop that will aid the Dakini's Whisper practitioners to discover their own versions of the Dakini. And we can have like a creative, artistic engagement with that history, because these images, I think, are very powerful and also help us move beyond just text into kind of a very emotional response to them. So your feedback and interest and time is like super appreciated. Thank you so much for being here. I'll stop streaming now. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much, Alimma. That was amazing. It was so informative. Oh my god, there's so many things rushing through my head. But yeah, does anyone have any comments, feedback, questions for Alimma? The amazing work that she's put together.
Abraham.
Thank you, Alimma. Wow, so interesting. Um, I just want to ask how how you got started this project. What's the origin, or how what triggered you to engage in this?
Um, yeah, thank you for asking. I think it's well, I think, coming from both an art history and an art kind of practice background, I find it just inevitable that when I really look at these images that we have of the Dakini and meditate on them, that some of these questions come up in my mind. And for a while, I tried to kind of block them out. I thought that maybe, oh, I need to really engage with the Dakini as a reality, kind of a pure method. But I find that actually, like, as soon as I started seeing a lot of these informations about other, kind of influences that might have happened, or just like something that might have emerged completely independently, I see this like really beautiful diversity open up where I feel like, oh, this is such an undeniable spiritual, psychological element, this kind of Dakini form that I'm glad that it's coming up all over the world. I'm glad that so many cultures are arriving at it, and that we're coming back to rediscovering it now if it had been lost in like some of our cultures. I think yeah, it makes me kind of, I don't know, I guess I see her everywhere through it, and I think that's also good for my version of the path anyway.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
inspiring and meaningful for us um, in many levels, but for us practitioners as well. Mm.
I'm glad you think
Thank
so.
There was definitely a few things that came up for me. I mean, yeah, it's so interesting. I guess my question, yeah, it's sort of similar in the sense because I think you touched on it briefly, Alimma, but there's I was looking at that book the other day that I don't remember who recommended it. Women Who Fly. That was recommended by somebody in one of the chats that we had, and I think it was Shauna actually. Maybe it was Shauna. But I just it's amazing just to see these incredible similarities come up cross culture everywhere, right? And you have with similar motifs over and over again. Um, and I've always had this very, very strong belief that these things sort of appear with many faces to different people in different cultures, with the face and with the face that the culture would understand, and the culture will have their own interpretation to it. But for you, seeing all of these sort of different emanations, I suppose, of the Dakini and all these different similarities, uh, I imagine that does something very, very special for your practice as well. Sort of to get this sort of confirmation, but also to get this absolute lived sense of like, that it's all over your mandala, regardless of where you are. And I mean, yeah, I'd love to sort of hear a little bit from your perspective as to when that really clicked for the first time, when you started to kind of get this strong sense of confirmation popping up, so to speak.
Well, I think that's actually interesting because as you say that, I remember the time when I first started like being very interested by Vajrayana and by Buddhism in general because I didn't grow up with it. I didn't have the fortune, I guess, of discovering it until I was just about to turn 20, and I was finishing my dissertation, and in that dissertation I was actually already starting to look at, I guess what I now know were forms of Dakini, but at the time I was kind of becoming very interested in the connection between like Abrahamic faith and Sumerian culture in the Mediterranean, because they move through each other so often. And so I was looking at like Lilith and Inanna, and what's that relationship, and how that form of femininity that those kind of transgressive figures embody became judged very differently as the faiths kind of continued to evolve, and something that was a heavenly goddess became kind of a demon that you guarded yourself against. And I find that in a lot of cultures. And so I think just doing that research when I was inevitably kind of coming up against the Kinis and Vedic goddesses, I was like, well, here they are, still venerated. But I wonder, how the relationship is different here, how the philosophy like fits together. And yeah, so it's this kind of, I guess, one of those things where it's like actually some of those images of Dakinis. I think one of the first ones I saw was like probably Kurokula, where I was like, oh wow, that's like so different to everything I've seen before, and it's so beautiful, and I really want to understand more. And like the fact that Buddhist interpretations don't have so much of like a mythological element, it's much more practice based, I think really then made me want to try practice. So I'm really glad it did. Yeah, thank you for asking that. I'm glad to have that memory.
That's amazing. Honestly, no, I really, really enjoyed that. I mean, there's and you make such a good point as well. Like, there's so many cultures that had to transition away as well from the divine feminine to the divine masculine as the age shifted. So in ancient Egypt, the age of Isis that was then succeeded by the age of Osiris, and this is talked about a lot in Western occultism for sure, but like historians have picked this up as well now more recently. Like Aleister Crowley, I think, really popularized this idea, where in trying to explicate this understanding of the people's relationship to the feminine and then to the masculine, and then how it shifts through ages, every age, and how there was an age of the age of Isis, representing sort of the night, and every day that the sun would go to sleep, and they would have to pray in order to get the sun back, so to speak, right? And then they shifted their relationship with death and the night itself, right? All of these aspects. It's sort of a very interesting transition. And the other thing, I'd never heard the Bhairava story, and and that was so interesting when you said it, because like the first thing that blinked into my head immediately was the if I can share it for a second, it was the so it's actually Nietzsche's idea of what happens when you kill God, right? Because Bhairava is manifested by Shiva because Brahma is getting too egoistic, basically, right? And so Bhairava goes off and cuts Brahma's head. And there's something really interesting there, because you need the divine feminine in order to put the masculine in check, so to speak. And that's always been another motif. And so Bhairava checks God, so to speak, cuts one of Brahma's heads off, and then is left with this like symbolic, like, oh yeah, you can't just kill a god, and all of a sudden the skull cup is stacked to his hand. Well, this is very much sort of the death of God's idea in the Nietzschean sense, because the people who kill gods, like we as a society killed God, so to speak, in the European sense, and he makes the same point in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He says, well, and now you have to carry the burden of that. It literally physically carry the burden of having killed God, and go through a process of atonement by which you become this Übermensch idea that Nietzsche then speaks of, right? The Übermensch, which embody, and Bhairava, I suppose, is the Übermensch in this idea. And again, Nietzsche not so much, but Jung later on plays a lot with the fact that it's actually the feminine side, not the masculine side, that does this within the person. The feminine side is the only thing that can cut off the masculine head. And it's the yin and yang in the back and lots of things that come up for me there, because I love studying like mythopoetry and stuff, and this really gets to the heart of it, I think. So yeah, really, really cool to see. So thank you so much for sharing that story.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's also just a couple of weeks ago that was my first time reading that story, and I didn't think about this connection. This is really why I wanted to be like a bigger workshop, because I just find it so exciting, like the connections that people make through their own like life and their own research and experiences, and like to see you like fully delve into that, because like the paper where I was getting some of this by I forgot her last name, Dr. Elizabeth, where she then talks about some of the other goddesses from the region who kind of have Bhairava assigned as their consort, because it's kind of becomes unacceptable for them to just be by themselves. And then actually in a lot of those stories, they then go and decapitate Bhairava because he becomes, too boisterous, and he becomes, the one who like pursues them against their will, and then that happens. Which is interesting because, when I hear people like Sam Rinpoche analyzed the iconography of Vajrayogini and Haruka, they are standing on like Bhairava and Bhairavi potentially. So kind of both of these aspects get quelled by the Vajrayana goddess, who is, I guess, beyond this kind of squabbling either. So that's
Yeah,
that's interesting.
that's so fascinating. That's amazing, honestly. No, it's exactly like you said. It's so nice to share these stories and then to see sort of what comes up in other people. And no, yeah, it's so interesting. Honestly, I'll definitely think about this a lot more in terms of the connections, because yeah, there's another connection with why doesn't Shiva go do it like herself, because there's also this idea that Shiva was very at the time, and so Shiva manifests the masculine in order to do it, right? And it's actually, there's an interesting connection that people then connected down to actually all of our fantasy stories, including like Snow White, for instance. And you can go all the way to Snow White, which is the archetypal story of a woman maturing, so to speak, and she is cast away, like her masculine structures around her crumble around her, right? To the death of her dad, and what she's left with is it's the castle of tyranny that is ruled by the stepmom, who symbolizes all the incredibly evil aspects of femininity, so to speak. And Snow White is the pure aspect, right? Snow White it tries to get away from that, so to speak. She's cast into the unknown. She has to go into the dark forest, the charnel ground, right, in some sense as well, right? And you were talking about the similarity between the forests and the charnel grounds there as well, the cremation grounds, and how she then has to essentially reintegrate, because it's not really the prince that saves her. That's a very common misconception. You can get into this sort of like really, really deeply, because actually what wakes her up from her dream is from her eternal sleep is actually her reintegration with like her divine feminine getting to the point that it needs to, so to speak, for her to really truly discover it. Because what actually puts her to sleep is this evil. It's this becoming this self-conscious awareness of her own beauty, therefore taking away her innocence and her purity. And it's a story of a return to that, actually, in the original story at least. So it comes up time and time and time in Cinderella, in Sleeping Beauty. And it keeps coming up all over the world. Like, you can really try to explicate all of these different stories and try to see sort of where they come up and how they come up. But the divine feminine always sneaks her way in, because she has to. She's like, she's just the reflection of everything that happens in society all the time. She just sits there all the time and watches. So yeah, no, it's fascinating, really, really fascinating talk, Alimma. No, I really enjoyed it.
I'm really glad. Yeah, that's so cool. I didn't know this analysis of Snow White. Is this like Campbell or yeah,
This is sort of post Campbell. So Campbell, yeah, this is really picked up by some later writers after Young, who are really taking on the mythopoetic movement, which was really kind of stirred off by Tolkien and some others sort of in the 20th century quite strongly. One of this, but there's I'll try and find you the reason. There's one woman who writes on this in such an incredible way. She doesn't do it with Snow White. She does it with a bunch of Latin American and folk stories across like South America, and I think parts of Southeast Asia as well. And she goes and finds all of these folk stories about women who dead, and how they are continuously struggling against, and she makes all of these connections. I'll definitely find you the book. It's really really good. Yeah, it's really really good.
I'm
I
sure we have tons of those in Japan too.
Yes.
folklore and the children's story. Such a yeah, interesting way to look into.
It's
By the way, Alima, you showed us that the picture drawing of the maybe eight or nine drawing. Is that something you did or you
Oh, I
copied?
wish. Those are, I believe those are Japanese.
Yeah,
One
yeah,
of the
Japanese. I was
artists.
looking closely, and that's a Japanese thing. So somebody did, huh? But it
Yeah,
seems like you do something like that. You remember you were creating the card, like a Dakini card or something, black and white, and a little bit of the red. So that's what I thought interesting.
yeah, I can show those. I did like a previous incarnation of this workshop where I was really focusing on the kind of non-binary aspect of some of these deities, like gender transgressive aspects, and also like, transgressing then the duality of life and death and things like that. And I made these cards that were kind of similar. And yeah, I can totally show those. And those were kind of for an in-person workshop. I had to like assign these words so that people would gravitate towards them in like of a emotional way before they get to hear the stories or some of the historical background, and then they would work through their interpretation and this kind of like artistic collaboration that everyone did. That was really fun because yeah, I then got to write on the back and also, kind of try to imitate some of the more famous historical depiction of these deities from different sources. And then I did my own interpretation for like a Central Asian Kazakh folk story that had some of these elements as well. And these were like some of the results. People, this was in Copenhagen, so they like wrote poetry. They did yeah, these like quite nice drawings. We didn't have too much time to do it, but it was very fun. Thank you.
Amazing. Cool. If there's no other questions, then I shall wrap up the recording as well. And just another huge thank you to Alimma for presenting this. It was such a lovely presentation. Thank you so much, Alimma, really honestly, for all of the work that you put into it.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to hear some of the ideas, and I might like start or continue. We have, I guess, one Dakini and folklore channel, and then yeah, I hope this is something that we can do as kind of a fully realized Dakini's Whisper workshop with some more sessions. But also by that time, I'm just making my way through quite a lot of different papers and books and images, and then I'll have like a bigger thing to offer everybody. And I thought, yeah, it could be very cool where people could either choose a particular story to work with and kind of create their response, or do it in groups, or kind of like create their own interpretations. I think, yeah, could be just a good way for us to see the Dakini through non-habitual eyes, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much.